Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This month, I'm talking to Natalie Lawrence, an author and illustrator who explores our relationship with the natural world, looking through multiple lenses, from the biological to the mythic and psychoanalytic. She completed an MSc and PhD in History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge, exploring the making and meanings of monstrous creatures in 17th century Europe. She published her first book as a teenager, Feathers and Eggshells, inspired by Hampstead Heath and the birds she was entranced with as a child, and published Planta Sapiens with Paco Calvo in 2022. She's also given a TEDx talk, appeared on BBC Radio, and worked with installation artists. In this chat, we talk about humans' fascination for monsters, how the walrus was originally conceived of as being a monster, the Hydra of Hamburg, cryptids as contemporary monsters, and the ways in which our understanding of what is real and what exists have changed over the centuries. Enjoy! Hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good as well. Obviously, we are here to talk about, in part, your book, which I'm trying to get the gold to show up on that lovely cover, Enchanted Creatures Are Monsters and Their Meanings. So, first of all, what prompted you to actually write this book?
Well, it derived partly from my PhD, which was about funny little monstrous creatures in the early modern period. And looking at those, like things like the pangolin or the walrus or the dodo, I saw that there was this that the way we can characterize the world in science or natural history can differ radically from what it's actually like for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of subjective reasons. And the way that those animals were made into monsters in the early modern period made me see all the ways in which we actually create monsters in other ways as well. And so I thought there was a space for introducing people to who maybe were not quite so familiar with monsters, introducing them to the way in which we project parts of ourselves out into the world and make monsters in the world as a way of dealing with aspects of ourselves and things we don't like. And monsters are often dealt with as kind of academic objects a lot and or as characters. And I wanted to approach them as kind of elements of the subconscious that are embodied in these horrible forms that we like watching on the cinema screen or reading about in books. Um, so it was a bit of an ambitious project because obviously it covers a lot of massive time span. Um, but I kind of wanted to show that there were common threads through history and through different types of monsters and through cultures, um, in our ways of monster making, and especially in terms of the way we use monster making to engage with the natural world as well.
Hmm. I mean, you've got a good range of monsters in there because you've got like Leviathan, who's probably not as well known as maybe should be, through to like Grendel's mother, who's obviously probably a lot more famous, I guess, if famous is the right word to use, all the way through to dinosaurs, which are like the coolest monsters. So, how did you actually decide what to include, given the huge range of strange and wonderful creatures that you get in like medieval bestiaries and things?
It was quite difficult to choose what to include because obviously you've got infinite different types of monsters that you could pick. I wanted to pick monsters that demonstrate different aspects of our relationship with other animals and with nature, and and monsters that embody different cultural issues through history. So I tried to make them as varied as possible in the different chapters because you've got everything from something like a pangolin to, Tiamat, the dragon goddess of in ancient Mesopotamia. So incredibly different entities, but I wanted to give an idea of the scope and then the commonalities between them, but also all the different roles that they can play culturally. And it's not a perfect collection because you could do it in so many different ways, but they were all monsters that I felt a connection with as well, and that I wanted to explore further, and that I felt had this richness that could be brought out. Um, and some that were more familiar and some that were less familiar too, because I didn't want everything to be brand new for readers. I also wanted to kind of present some more familiar monsters in a slightly new way, and also introduce some monsters that people might not have encountered so much before.
Hmm. Were there any monsters that you really wanted to include but just didn't have space for?
There were there were quite a lot. I had to limit the scope because otherwise I would have probably sent myself to an insane asylum. I think I would have really liked to have been able to have more space to include the kind of small scale, more folkloric monsters. A lot of the monsters I included quite big mythic figures, and I would have liked to have had more space to delve into a more local folkloric cultures. Sometimes also some more amusing ones like the Wolpertinger, like the German jackrabbit, ones that had a slightly more humorous side, or some of the kind of the cats that the big cats that are meant to slink around the British countryside, that kind of thing, and explore their kind of much more local meanings. But it was had to stop at some point, so I had to put some limits on it.
Yeah, because when I was going through it, I was sort of looking at them going, obviously you've got like Tiamat and I say Grendel's monster, and then you're like, ooh, pangolin, and I love pangolins. And then, ooh, walruses. And I was kind of like, I mean, they are pretty big, and I know when we've had them recently in the news, when they suddenly pop up like sunbathing on someone's boat or whatever. But for the benefit of listeners, how did the walrus get sort of reconfigured as a monster?
So in some ways, it started out as a monster and then got configured as an animal. So I first came across the early modern walrus in as an entry in Olaus Magnus. He was a Norwegian ecclesiast. He was writing in the mid 17th century, and he produced this book called De Gentibus, which was all about it was a history of the northern peoples and its flora and fauna and the way that people lived in the north. Because and then he also produced this map called the Carta Marina, which is a very famous depiction of the northern seas and lands. And throughout the map and the book, he puts all of these kind of monstrous figures and monstrous creatures. And in one of the entries in this book is the De Rosmaris, which is the walrus. But this walrus has kind of spikes, a spiky mane. It's got tusks coming upwards. It's kind of clenching onto a cliff and looking menacingly at at a boat behind it. And it's got four legs and a tail. And so it's quite a scary looking beast. You think I wouldn't want to meet that on a dark night. And he told stories about how the walruses would climb up cliffs with their teeth and hook into them like ice picks and then hang there. So they had a sort of funny form of narcolepsy where they get to the top of the cliff hanging by their teeth and they'd hang there, sort of swaying in their sleep a little. And then hunters would come and tie ropes around their tails and then scare the walruses, and the walruses would jump off the cliff, leaving their skins behind. So there was all this kind of slightly strange folklore about these monsters, which he included. And this book that he wrote and the Carta Marina, the map, were aimed at building up the mythology of the marvelous around the North for European audiences or audiences in the continent of Europe. And there was already a long and rich tradition of sea monsters. Pliny's natural history is full of them. There'd always been stories of sea monsters. So the idea that the Rosmaris, which was the walrus, existed wasn't didn't no one would bat an eyelid. And people were also just starting to go. You have kind of Danish and Dutch sailors going north and starting to hunt large mammals in the Arctic seas as well. Relatively new. And then also some from the Iberian Peninsula as well. And they were starting to bring back bits of bodies of these gigantic sea creatures. They didn't bring the whole thing back because they're too large. What they do is they sort of battle them in their boat and then butcher them on the ice. So you have pieces of walrus coming back to Europe. You have stories of these hunters that have gone out and risked their lives on Arctic seas, telling everyone how courageous and brave they've been and how amazing these products they brought back are. And then you've also got you've got this long history of sea monsters in texts, and you've got Olaus Magnus writing about all the monsters. And so it's very easy to imagine this vast, ferocious Rosmaris, which, would kill you as soon as look at you. Um, no one saw a walrus as well. And they are large, really large. And their horn was also sold as unicorn horn a lot as well. So there was a commercial interest in building up the monstrousness and the marvelousness of these northern animals as well, because obviously that made it more valuable, the products. There was a kind of idea that walrus skin was impossibly strong and couldn't be broken if you made rope from it. There was actually there was one walrus that came to Europe, which was a pup that came to Amsterdam, and there's a description of it, sort of roaring fiercely. This must have been this little animal roaring fiercely and being put in this tub of water and being fed porridge oats and sort of slurping mightily. And I the description also includes a description of how tasty walrus fat was. So I don't really want to know what happened to the pup. I don't think it probably lasted that long. Um, but yeah, so all of these things together, people kind of constructed this monstrous image of the walrus that lasted a long time because no one saw one except people who went out and killed them. And it was also the walrus was also very boundary crossing as well. It sort of had this idea that it was a horse that it was called a hrosvals, like a horse whale. There was a traditional idea that things that existed on land had a counterpart in the sea. So it was almost like this hybrid had this hybrid description as well of being a horse and a whale or a hairy whale. Um, yeah.
It's absolutely strange because I know they've got one. Is it at the Honeyman Museum where they didn't know what they looked like, so they just kept stuffing it and stuffing it and stuffing it, so it just hasn't got any wrinkles on it anywhere.
I think that one was a little bit later. I think that might be early 19th century. I think that one. But yeah, it just shows how long these misconceptions last for.
I think as well something from what I gathered from the book seemed to happen that was similar with the pangolin, where they had no idea, no frame of reference for what this creature was. Um, so obviously considering you've looked at actual creatures and obviously these mythical ones as well, is it quite common that animals that we're just not familiar with become monsters, or do you think people are actually unconsciously looking for monsters?
Oh, that's interesting. I think there is, I think there is an inherent process by which we have a framework. All humans have a framework that they use to understand the world, or they have frameworks they use to understand the world. And those frameworks are never going to be perfect. They're never going to include all the things you're going to encounter. And if you encounter something that doesn't fit, you're like, whoa, what's that? And I think actually, even now, I mean, I think the pangolin has had a moment in the sun, so more people know what they are. But 10 years ago, most people didn't really know what a pangolin looked like. So they would see a pangolin and they would be like, what on earth is that? And they would actually have a very similar reaction to pangolins to people 400 years ago when they saw pangolins. Um, they thought they were um, some people describe them as artichokes or as like pig lizards or pine cones. They kind of couldn't quite decide whether they were warm-blooded mammal-like creatures or whether they were scaly reptiles. They couldn't get over the fact they had fur and scales. Um, so because they were going out with Aristotelian categories. So these very clear-cut categories of where all the different organisms sat. And that did not include a mammal that had scales.
Hmm.
So it really so when you had travelers to let's say Java or the East Indies and around there, and they came across pangolins, they were completely boggled by them. So one of the things that creates monsters is boundaries. If you have categories, things that don't fit into those categories or kind of in between categories or transgressing categories are monsters. So something like a pangolin is a kind of classic example of this, where looks a bit lizardy, looks a bit mammally. Which one is it? Also seemed to like water as well, so it had this kind of fish-like quality too, because they can swim quite well. Um, so it didn't, because it didn't fit into any of the categories they used to understand the world, they put it into the monster category, and that was kind of a way of dealing with a lot of new things. So we're talking kind of 17th century here. This is a way of dealing with new things. The world was expanding rapidly at this point in history. People were discovering new cultures, new land, new animals, new plants, and it was kind of overwhelming. Um, and it really rattled the traditional knowledge that they'd used, the kind of set traditional knowledge frameworks that had been maintained for a long period before that. Um, and must have been quite unsettling, but it was also not that problematic because if something didn't fit, you could just say, well, that's just a monster. And you just say, well, he's odd, isn't he? Okay. You know? Um, so it was also making things into monsters was a way of kind of just saying, well, that's an oddball. Let's put it in the bucket with the others. And there was this kind of idea that the creator was meant to have put jokes everywhere in creation. And therefore, if you came across something weird, it was sort of one of the funny little things that had been left for you to find and, have a little giggle about. So it wasn't unexpected to find monsters.
Hmm.
They were kind of expected to exist.
So monsters were essentially a bit like God's Easter eggs, just out in
Yeah,
creation.
exactly. Yeah.
I quite like that.
This is kind of, yeah, this is slightly, it was this idea of ludus, this kind of the playful creator, which is quite, it's a nice contrast to the sort of fire and brimstone image that one has. But yeah, there's this like playfulness in nature. There's all sorts of weird stuff is going to exist, and you might be lucky enough to come across it.
I mean, it would explain a lot of the things that you get right at the bottom of the ocean when you get, the creatures where you're like, that's going to be dealing with like so much pressure and so on. But it's such an odd looking thing. I suppose you would look at that and go, that had to be a joke.
Yeah. I think also it's because when you take them up from down the bottom of the sea, the pressure change means they look much weirder than I think
Hmm.
like the blobfish, for example, is like meant to be it's one of the ugliest things that you can photograph, but actually they don't look that bad. Well, relatively, they don't look that bad when they're actually in their the right pressure level, but when you bring them up, then they everything goes south. Um, which some of us can. Some of us
I was
can
going to say that's just the aging process.
yeah.
Would you say that a lot of this betrays obviously Eurocentrism in science writing? So I was wondering, is there any examples of it going the other way? So
Mm.
a writer from another continent then comes to Europe, say, and encounters some of the animals which obviously aren't native to where they're from, and they go, "Oh my God, that must be a monster," or is it very much a Eurocentric problem?
So there's lots of layers to that question. So it was Eurocentric in terms of travel was really difficult. So most people didn't go anywhere. So most people wrote about what they knew or what they heard about, and it was filtered through quite a colonial lens in that the reason to go out to other distant places was to go and see what resources you could find. Can you find different medicines? Can you find riches, slaves, etc. Um, so it was about seeing what value we can find in other places to some degree. And some of the the naturalists who are going out to places like the East Indies or South America were looking for things that were of commercial value. So there is a kind of how's this going to benefit us aspect to it. Um, and but then again, um, the idea of Europe didn't really exist. Italy didn't exist yet, Germany didn't exist. So a lot of these countries weren't, a lot of the European countries didn't exist. And there wasn't that level of cohesion and the sense of kind of Western culture either. But there was a sense beyond Christendom, the civilized countries. You go out there as exotic places with a bunch of savages. So there was quite an us and them othering effect. And that spilled out into the science writing. So that spilled out into the way that they saw other organisms. So something like the pangolin was perceived as, in some places, especially where things were a bit spiky between the Europeans and the non-Europeans, um, they perceived the pangolin as kind of aggressive, as if it tried to actively undermine, dig under buildings and make them fall down or try and kill people. And I think now the idea of a pangolin trying to kill anyone is kind of funny. But they thought it could strangle you if it got around your neck. There definitely, but I think there is also a lot of Eurocentrism in the history of, in the way that this history has been perceived. And this is being rectified a lot now, but late 20th century, there was this sense of all of these colonialist Europeans going out and discovering things. And actually, there was so much interchange at a macro level. So you had things flying all over the world in all directions. We had Sinophiles here, but we've also, but Japanese and Chinese courts, they were obsessed with European products as well. And there certainly were animals that were seen as very interesting. I think in terms of the European animals like horses and dogs, for example, that would have moved around the world, there aren't many written sources that give a clear idea of reactions. I think there are records of South American reactions to seeing humans on horses and the idea that they were kind of centaur-like monsters. Um, there's some great examples of animals being moved around. Like there was a dodo that got moved. It got taken to the Mughal court in the 17th century. And it got probably by the VOC, the East India Company. And it was painted around 1600 by an artist called Mansur. So the Dutch East India Company was in control of Mauritius, and they would have been trading around the Indian Ocean, and they took a dodo clearly to the Mughal court and as a gift, and then that dodo got painted by the artist there, and it was in a menagerie of kind of fabulous birds. So there was a lot more circulation than we tend to think, and there was a lot more exchange than we tend to think. And some of that exchange must have been animals that seemed exotic in other places that weren't seen as exotic in Europe.
Mm. You do wonder like how somebody would encounter, for example, a hedgehog, which to obviously anyone in sort of Europe, I guess, you're like, oh, aren't they quite sweet? But I suppose it would be a bit like coming across a porcupine for people. If you'd never seen one before, you would be like, my God, what is this animal that I'm looking at? So I guess that you can sort of imagine how certain animals, whereas, yeah, something like a rabbit, considering, I mean, they were introduced here anyway. I don't imagine people would freak out at the sight of a rabbit.
Yeah, because it wasn't like all animals were seen as monsters just because they weren't familiar. I think there are some reactions to European depictions of animals, like lions or manticores. So some of the kind of more bestiary images in places like the Mughal court, where they had a cleaner depiction style and a cleaner symbolism. And this is these sort of grotesque, much more grotesque depictions of animals. We've seen it. They're a bit snooty about them. I think. What are you doing?
I quite like that. So there is some degree of people looking at them going, but not necessarily for the animal, but just for the way it was depicted. I like that. Bit of art
You bunch of
criticism going on.
lunatics.
I do love manticores, and it really upsets me that they're not more well known because they do just look like an angry child drew them. So I'm like, why are they not more famous? One monster that I've never actually featured on the podcast,
Mm,
and I'm not quite sure why, is the Hydra, and I find Hydras really quite interesting. But could you tell us about specifically the Hydra of Hamburg?
yeah. So this is one of the kind of standout items in the curiosity collection circuit in 17th century Europe. There was just as a bit of background, the in the 17th century there was a big explosion in Wunderkammer or curiosity collections. So loads of people had collections that they styled their own images with. So they would collect rare and beautiful things, they would collect exotic objects, they would try and put things together in really interesting ways and essentially give their it was like a way, it was a bit like having your own Instagram page or something like that. It's a way of self-styling, demonstrating your personality and your learning and your access to resources. And some of these were massive. So if obviously the big princely collections, big rich merchants would have really sizable collections. And the most wealthy collectors were able to pick up the most exotic and rare specimens like dragons and hydras. Um, and there were kind of these fictions maintained about these items for a while, because usually what they were was a kind of a lizard that had been overstuffed with some fish bits and some monkey, a bit of monkey, like monkey paws or kind of weasel paws or all these odd bits of animals sewn together. And the Hamburg of Hydra was one of these. Sorry, the Hydra of Hamburg. It had originally been made by a bunch of monks in a church, and it was plundered in the Battle of Prague. in 1640s, I think. Um, and it had been used as a kind of way of instilling the fear of fire and brimstone, like the beast of revelation on on the congregation in this church by these monks. It would have been paraded out as this evidence of the terrible fate awaiting them should they sin. It was only about 2 meters long. It wasn't, or like 1.5, 2 meters long. So it wasn't, this wasn't a terribly scary item. Um, but it had a kind of knobbly brown hide and this long scaly tail, and I think it had 7 heads like the beast in Revelation, and they had sharp teeth. And had you not seen anything like that before, it might have been quite scary. But once it was plundered, it then got taken around as a kind of a curiosity for sale around Europe. And I think it started off as incredibly desirable. So the Danish king, he offered 30,000 thalers for it, which was like a couple of years' salary for a skilled workman. But over time, for some reason, its value started to decline. Early 18th century, it was selling for a few thousand thalers, and then it really disappeared into obscurity when Carl Linnaeus had a look at it and said, that's just a bunch of weasel paws and some reptile bits." And then the kind of mystery of the whole thing collapsed, and everyone was like, "All right, I'm not interested anymore." So it was a kind of, but there was a really interesting relationship between reality and fantasy with these kinds of dragon figures. There were plenty of dragons that were owned by famous collectors who they would have streams of people coming to visit them, and they'd all write in the book saying, in the visitors' book, saying how marvelous it had been and how it was an incredible object, and they couldn't believe he owned a dragon and this and that. Even though it must have been obvious that this was not real. So it was kind of like this sort of dance they were all doing together of kind of ego stroking and pretend fantasy that they were playing because it didn't really matter that it wasn't real. The idea was that it was experiencing something fabulous for a short period of time. A bit like we do in the cinema.
Mm. I think this is the thing when you look at things like, the later ones, like the Fiji mermaids and things like that, and you sort of look at them and go, people must have known that this was fake. But I suppose, yeah, when you're right, if you go back even further, why would somebody know it was fake? Particularly if someone with authority like a monk went, this is a real thing, you'd go, okay.
I mean, you're going to have very different types of, I mean, if you think about the difference in education at this point, most people aren't literate. Um, you'll have a bunch of highly educated people who, can write an encyclopedia, and then you're going to have a bunch of people who can't even read. So you're talking about very different groups of people. If you've been preached to your whole life about, the Book of Revelation and dragons and that there's going to be all these the apocalypse is going to hit and there's going to be all these monsters that emerge from the seas, and then a monk exactly shows you this dragonish object, you might well believe them. And there was a long history of images of dragons, so that they're in the Christian canon. You've got St. George and the Dragon. There are all these stories about them. So in some ways they do kind of exist because they exist in people's imaginations, and they are believed to exist in the distant places that you can't see for yourself. Um, but at that time there was kind of the idea of scientific truth didn't really exist then. You do have people who are very skeptical. So you have people who know that what they're looking at is not a dragon, but it doesn't disprove that dragons exist in most of these descriptions still. It's just this one might not be real. Um, and because they existed as moral symbols in some ways, that was enough for them to exist because the world was a bunch of moral symbolism, really. The things in nature that you encountered were aspects of God's creation, and therefore they had meaning. And therefore, if you have an image of something that might exist in nature that has meaning, there's no reason to believe it doesn't exist, even
Mm.
if you haven't seen it. Um, so it's a very different conception of truth to what we have now in terms of, for us, truth is it scientifically true? And we accept subjective truth as well, but those things are kind of, we try and keep them separate. Unless it exists physically in the world and it's scientifically provable, then it's not true. Whereas back then there's this much more porosity between different types of reality.
Hmm. So is that why sort of if I think of, for example, quite a lot of the folklore things that people would, I'll ignore remedies because I think some people genuinely thought that some of them worked. But when you think of even just like a tradition,
Mhm.
like horseshoe over the door to keep evil spirits away, we would look at that and be like, don't be silly. That, I mean, it might keep someone away if it drops off and hits them, but generally speaking, it's not real in like a protective sense, I suppose most people would assume. But you might put one up anyway just in case. I
Mhm.
quite like your hedging your bets there sort of idea that people do. But then at the same time, yeah, so in previous centuries, people would have had that kind of sense of, well, it might not work, but then it also might. And they're kind of sitting in a bit more of a nuanced space, I think. And that I found really interesting in the book, the idea that like real and existing weren't actually the same thing.
Mhm.
Because it's just so alien, I think, to our way of thinking. Like, and I love science. I love like this being a thing because it can be proved. But at the same time, I quite like the idea of, yeah, we can't prove that unicorns are real, but who knows? I quite like that sort of sense almost.
Yeah, that's a really good, yeah, real and existing are not the same thing is a very good way of putting it. It also, in a way, I think it's more natural to the way that our minds work. Because if you think about how what we do when we experience the world is we create we're essentially living in a controlled hallucination the whole time. So it can really be anything, really. What's going on in here could be anything. And so we live in a space that isn't actually necessarily bounded by the laws of physics and chemistry in our minds. And that means that you can have images and you can have objects that have subjective meaning that are important, that and it doesn't really matter if they exist or not in the physical world. Um, and I think because we're so obsessively regimented in the way that I mean, I'm a big proponent of science, obviously, so I'm a scientist by training, so I'm not anti-science. But I do also feel like we have, I mean, it's why religion exists. We have a need for something else as well as scientific truth. And I think that was better integrated socially before science became the dominant way of seeing things. I mean, obviously, a marvelous array of different things have come from science that I'm very grateful for. I love antibiotics, etc. But it has also had a cost as well in terms of the way we exist in the world and our our understandings of our need for these other subjective realities. And I think we create them if we don't if they're not built in culturally, like you know, all the conspiracy theories, and people getting all the cultural wars that are going on, etc. People are building up fantasies in all sorts of ways that are actually driving us apart rather than being a kind of cohesive symbolic system that brings people together. So it can actually be very damaging to try and pretend that we can operate as objective scientific beings without need for anything else.
Mm.
It's why cults get started.
Yeah. Yeah, I must admit, I mean, I love science, big fan. Vaccines, hip replacements, they're all great. And I think the one thing I do notice is when people will, for particular arguments, one way or another, will sort of be like, "Oh, do you not have a basic understanding of science?" And you're like, "Yeah, but there is no basic understanding of science because there's no basic science. It's all quite complicated." So I always find that one a little bit of a weird oxymoron in and of itself.
Yeah, the people who ask if you have a basic understanding of science are people who don't understand science at all because they think it's basic.
So, bearing all this in mind, and obviously the fact that we don't have people like warning you on TripAdvisor about manticores out and about and all that kind of, which would be amazing. I would love to see that review. But we do have, and you did mention this earlier, sort of the idea of like the British big cats and things like
Mm,
that, and of just cryptids everywhere.
mm.
Do you think cryptids have sort of taken over from monsters as the closest thing that we might have, except now we've got cameras, so we're trying to photograph them?
I think, yeah, that's a brilliant kind of connection, I think, actually, because they like the dragons, they exist in that we all know what Nessie is or Bigfoot is, etc. But we we also know they don't exist, but they kind of do in our minds, and therefore they have a kind of a virtual existence. There are actually whole communities of people who call themselves Bigfooters. There's a Bigfooting community of people who have had a an experience that convinced them that Bigfoot was real, and they spend the rest of their lives, or however long, trying to prove that Bigfoot is real. I don't know if you've come across this. A lot more in the States, I think, than in the UK. Um, and they painstakingly collect all the evidence that's available. And a lot of it is basically absent. More of it's absence of evidence, a kind of noticeable gap in an explanation for something rather than positive evidence. You know, you're not finding fur, but there's a lack of other explanations for how some kind of dramatic event occurred and therefore must be Bigfoot. So it's more like Bigfoot is kind of filling an
Mm.
explanatory space. Um, and they have this kind of obsessive need to demonstrate the fact that Bigfoot exists. And if you think about the motivations for that, it is it does kind of demonstrate what I was talking about in terms of this gap for something else um and the need for the idea that there are fantastical, strange things out there and that the world is not totally explicable. This kind of interface between meaning and truth, meaning and reality. Um, and we've also kind of I think Nessie is another really good one. Like Nessie has been consistently searched for ever since she first popped into the cultural imagination. Um, and there's been some notable hoaxes, like there's that surgeon photo from the
Mm.
1930s, which everyone has seen of the kind of the sort of flipper coming out of the water. But even in 2003, um, they were doing sonar and genetic testing in Lake Loch Ness, which was funded by the BBC. This, this, this sort of what plesiosaur or whatever Nessie's meant to be. And there's still like 10 reports a year or something coming in about Nessie. So you can say that Nessie's not real, but that's sort of more attention than a lot of species, real species are getting, you know, and a
Mhm.
lot so there is a reality there that isn't necessarily objective, but it's definitely powerful.
I think that's where the British big cats are an interesting one because obviously big cats in and of themselves do exist. Whether they're prowling round beside, Asda's car park, I think is possibly the bit where we're a little bit unsure. But I think that's where I'm always a bit like, no, they're not roaming. Then you go, are they? Because I've never encountered one, thankfully. But that doesn't mean they're not there. But then at the same time, you're like, surely somebody would notice. And I guess that's the whole point behind it. I've got an episode on them,
Well,
and
have they noticed?
this is the thing. People are so convinced that they're out there, and then you're kind of like, well, as long as they're out there and not in here, am I really bothered?
Hmm.
Because I'd quite like the idea of there being big cats just kind of roaming about and so on. So they are a really interesting one. But then, of course, the one difference with cryptids, I guess, is we've got obviously the very blurry photos that we often have of them as evidence. And obviously, in an era of Photoshop and now AI, who's to say? Have they, in some ways, taken over from kind of these taxidermied animals, do you think, as hoaxes? Or again, is it just how people are interpreting the information that's in front of them?
Taking over in terms of they're filling that role of kind of the tangible fantastic in terms
Mhm.
of, you know, we've got this dragon that is made out of lizard skin, but we're going to all pretend it's a dragon. I think so, yeah, definitely that because, well, there may be more of a testing to see whether it stands up to scientific truth, but there's still plenty of people who keep believing that they're not hoaxes. You know, it always divides opinion, but it also all the taxidermied creatures also divided opinion. Plenty of people knew they weren't real or questioned whether they were real. Um, so they do sit in that liminal space, which is what monsters are meant to do. So it's exactly in the job description. Um, and they do exactly they do make you think, is that is there something there? Like what there's a phenomenon here that we're observing. What could be causing it? It does create this kind of intrigue and interest, and make you think that perhaps we don't really know everything. And if you think about all the weird creatures that we keep discovering on the seafloor. I mean, there's more weird stuff around than you could possibly imagine. So actually, really, the fact that, just the fact that it's been scientifically described doesn't necessarily stop something being monstrous.
Mm. Thinking about it, the one is it a species that I can see that being applied to would actually be something like fungi, where we
Mm.
just keep discussing or describing, no, discovering new fungi, and then it does something weird like, you know, eating the radiation from Chernobyl's reactor 4 or something, and you're like, that is kind of cool, but kind of monstrous at the same time. That is the stuff of B movies. So it is quite interesting how we have this entire class of thing that we don't really understand already, and yet we don't always necessarily see them as monsters. They're just a bit weird.
Although they lead to monsters very easily. So with
Yes.
The Last of Us, I think they're almost some of the most terrifying. Yeah, fungi are kind of the sort of ultimate uh, monster organisms in a way because they know no boundaries whatsoever. They will cross any boundary you put on organismal life, and they they will violate it in some way. And that is both intriguing and also terrifying, and has all these possibilities, as my friend Merlin Sheldrake is explaining to everyone so well. But also is kind of throwing everyone for a loop because what do we do with it? We have to kind of pull apart a bit like the weird beasties in the early modern period. We have to pull apart all of our understanding of things because it clearly doesn't account for everything.
Mm,
There's a sort of new disruptive phenomenon um, that we need to kind of rethink things, rethink the way that life operates to some
mm.
degree.
Yeah, because obviously that's where it's like they're not the plant kingdom, they're not the animal kingdom, they're this whole extra kingdom. And so anyone who played Mario knows the mushroom kingdom is a thing anyway. But I guess it is it is quite interesting seeing how all this works. And I suppose that makes me think like, why are we actually drawn to monsters, even though obviously clearly there's many of them you wouldn't want to encounter. We've
Mm.
clearly got some fascination with them. Even people who are like super rational and so on will still have like a favorite monster or something like that. So what is it about them that would just keep going, yes, that?
So on a surface level, we love stuff that just surprises us. We love, and monsters are so often, I mean, this is the sort of banal answer. They're so often shocking in some way. They're super big. They put things together that shouldn't be together. They violate the boundaries that we expect. So they kind of they shock our expectations in some way, and that automatically gets our attention. Um, I think often the reason why some monsters last for so long is because they act as cultural carriers for lots of different, very important issues or lots of different, very important anxieties. So if you look at something like Frankenstein, the new Frankenstein movie just came out. Since Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, the creature has been able to morph through all these different versions and carry all sorts of different valences and have all sorts of different meanings depending on kind of what's going on culturally at the time. And the monster can act as that receptacle for those different meanings. So at any one time, the monsters that are kind of top of the imagination are going to be ones that have that flexibility and that power to represent things that are really important to us and things often that we are horrified by and that we can't almost bear to face, but also are kind of morbidly fascinated by. And so because they're often parts of our own psyches that we don't really want to directly acknowledge, but they also are things we can't really get away from as well. So in kind of the matter that they're made of is both horrifying and it, like irresistibly attractive to us. I think vampires are a really good example of this. They're horrifying and violent and bloody, but they're also incredibly alluring. It's kind of this that mix, that combination is made very explicit with vampires. And they can represent anything you want, really, as well.
Yeah, because I was thinking, I sort of, at what point they did monsters become cool? Because when you think of like, in cinema in particular, and you sort of have all the like the monster movies of like the rough from the 30s onwards, I guess. And now you sort of have like about a million Godzilla films and so on, and they seem to just keep popping back. I mean, obviously horror in particular is cyclical anyway,
Mm.
But it's like it's the fact that sometimes they can be the coolest thing about a film because it's just been not very well written. But is there the sense that people are drawn to the monster just purely because it's the different thing in the film rather than the humans where we're used to them? Or and is this also why like serial killers are fascinating because they're depicted as being monstrous? And again, it's that fear of the other that we actually find quite enticing.
I think some of the recent I think with the development of the way of depicting monsters, they've got more and more hyper realistic. So it's like you can see something that doesn't exist and it's enough to be believable. So that has a basic kind of attraction to it. I think also there's more psychological awareness of what monsters mean as well in commonly in 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 cultural kind of discourse. And therefore you're getting more and more of these kind of high art versions of monsters like Nosferatu or like Eggers films, and he's making werewolf as well, which should be really good. Um, and and like Del Toro's Frankenstein. So they're kind of becoming they're gaining increasing cultural cachet in higher brow circles as well and becoming kind of cooler entities to associate yourself with. Um, but I think they but I think they have always been absolutely fascinating and always been things that pulled in big crowds. Right from, Barnum's Circus and the freak shows to Frankenstein will probably pull in a decent whack at the box office, I imagine. So I don't think they've ever really not been cool at a level.
Have you got a favorite monster?
Um, Oddly, because I didn't include them in the book, vampires are some of my favorite monsters because I just love how deftly they move between time periods and roles as well. I think they represent something very, very fundamental psychologically. This something that everyone shares, a kind of in a developmental stage, and they also can be used to represent almost any kind of cultural issue that you want them to demonstrate. Partly because there's always power imbalances and um, there's always social division in some way or other. So vampires are an amazing tool for representing that.
Yeah, very much so. Of course, now all I can think of is the Count from Sesame Street, so that shows where my brain went.
I was thinking of Sinners, which is one of the more recent ones, which was just amazing.
Yeah, the cool option then, not the Count from Sesame Street. So, oh, that says a lot. So what are you working on now, and where can people find you online?
So I'm on Instagram, natalie.j.lawrence, or my website is nataliejlawrence.com. What am I working on now? I am having a little bit of a break, but I think my next project might be on mermaids and mermaids in literature. And then in when I finally have some time, I might start writing a book about Dionysus. But that's all very prospective at the moment.
Why
So,
Dionysus?
because he's a monster god.
True.
And I think his story there's a lot that reflects on the way we live in the modern world. And there's a lot to think about in respect to that. So yeah, I think it's a good time for him to come out the woodwork a bit more.
Mm, yeah, very much so. Excellent. Well, that's all very good. It's been absolutely lovely talking to you. I do recommend everybody actually checks out the book as well. Because of the fact you've got such a nice range of monsters in there, so it's not like the usual suspects, but then there are some surprises in there as well. So I think people will probably enjoy, well, they should enjoy that. They've been told. But it's been really nice chatting to you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hoped you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record, and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles, and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.